right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. It is the best day of the week here on the podcast. It is Fitness Athlete Friday, and I am your host today, Dr. Zach Long. I'm lead faculty inside our Clinical Management of the Fitness Athlete Division, specifically teaching our Advanced Concepts course and our live courses alongside Mitch Babcock. So I'm excited to talk today about some unconventional and underutilized loading strategies that I think more physical therapists should be adopting with their patients, clinically and in their own training as we try to improve our own movement and practice what we preach. You can go back and listen to Jeff Moore's podcast from yesterday, where he talked about being about it for a little bit of inspiration around that and why we need to be adopting and practicing the things that we always talk about in physical therapy specifically. So before we dive into this topic, let's talk about a couple upcoming courses that we have, and let's look out into June and what's coming up in a few weeks. So on June 5th, we got 3 courses happening around the country. First off, Rehab of the Injured Runner going down in Parker, Colorado, and Onward, Denver. So check that course out, as well as Clinical Management of the Fitness Athlete in Bozeman, Montana. I think they only have a couple of spots left for that Bozeman spot. So check that course out quickly if you're in that area. And then we have Modern Management of the Older Adult happening in Olney, Maryland. The 2 weekends later, June 19th, MMOA, Modern Management Older Adult, is in Mesa, Arizona. And then the Lumbar Spine Management course will be in Richmond, Virginia at Onward Richmond. All right, let's dive into today's topic. Underutilized loading strategies, what we as physical therapists should be using in our own movement practices, and what we can be using clinically to help our patients out. Some of these you're going to be a little bit familiar with, but probably don't utilize as much as I think you should. Some of these might be completely new to you in terms of what we typically think of with loading. So let's first off start with resistance bands. And when I'm talking resistance bands, I'm not talking about pulling out our TheraBand loops and doing the same old exercise that all physical therapists do. I'm talking about pulling out big resistance bands, like the large Rogue pull-up assistance band loops. They're multiple feet long. They go in a variety of different thicknesses, but they will significantly challenge us from a load perspective more than others. I like using resistance bands because they're a fantastic way for us to bias specific movements towards specific muscle groups or portions of a range of motion. And that lets us get really varied in our training and really emphasize certain things over others. So let me give you a couple examples of what I mean with this. So if we're talking about like a squat, for example, we can use a resistance band where one of these large, heavy resistance bands is around both of our knees, kind of pulling the knees into valgus, pulling the knees medially, which would obviously, if we're then pressing our knees out into the band, would bias the hips a little bit more, make our glutes work a little bit harder during a squat. Or we could put the resistance band right behind the knees with that band pulling straight away from the body. So now the band is creating a little bit of knee flexion on the knee. So it's trying to bend the knee, meaning the quads will have to work harder. So that's called a Spanish squat, which is a great variation to really increase loading on the quads, specifically around a squat. Or we could do a hip hinge pattern where that individual has a band around their hips tied to a rig or something stable behind them. So now the band is resisting the lockout of a hip hinge pattern, which is a great way for us to specifically load the glutes up a little bit more and focus on that portion of the range of motion. Or maybe let's say somebody's dealing with back pain and they want to deadlift, they want to be doing hip hinge movement patterns, but they're not ready to handle quite as much compressive loads in the spine. So we keep the load in the legs heavy by using that resistance band. This is one of those things that I think you should be regularly playing with your movement practice. Buy a set of these resistance bands, attach it to a rig, and let's say you're going to the gym, you're deadlifting that day, do your heavy barbell deadlifts, and then get the band and put it in different positions on kind of some work down sets or as accessory work, and just see what happens when a band pulls certain directions from certain angles. Where does that change the load you feel on your own body? If you would spend 20 minutes a week doing this, I think your ability to prescribe exercise to patients would improve dramatically as you feel these changes in your body from different positions of the loading. It would allow you to then say, okay, I felt how this movement made my hips work significantly harder, but didn't challenge my back as much. Or this setup challenged my back more, my hips less. And that's going to let you fine tune your exercise prescription so much more just by practicing what we preach and playing around with movement a little bit. The other thing you can do with resistance bands is you can use them to emphasize specific portions of a range of motion. So let's say a bench press, for example. If we do a bench press, as that bar comes down, if we have resistance bands on in addition to weight, the resistance band tension goes down when that bar is towards our chest, and it increases as we go to the lockout. So we could use this from a performance perspective. If somebody's weaker in the lockout and we want to specifically train that portion, we can do resistance bands bench press. Or let's say somebody's shoulder is more sensitive to being in that extended position, less sensitive when they're getting towards lockout. Let's use resistance bands to kind of match that curve of where they tolerate load or not. So maybe that load's pretty low at the bottom, not to the point where it's bothering the shoulders, but at the top it's really heavy and still making them work really hard through the bench press. So resistance bands are a fantastic tool that we do not utilize enough. The second loading strategy I want to talk about is using inefficient positions. And this is, of course, when I say using inefficient positions, PTs are going to freak out a little bit thinking, oh my gosh, this is not going to go well. But I really think, especially for those of us that don't have a lot of equipment, that sometimes playing around with inefficient positions where people are using suboptimal biomechanics can then let us load certain tissues to specifically load that tissue, be more emphasis on that, or to sub for a lack of equipment. Now, I think it's really important to note here that I'm not saying that moving in inefficient positions is the best way to move maximal load. I'm not talking about like deadlifting and maximal spine flexion, but there are a number of times where getting out of specific positioning can be valuable in the clinic. So I want to talk about two examples of this. So if you think of like a close grip bench press, so going about shoulder width grip, usually when individuals close grip bench press, they keep their forearms kind of close to vertical. And that allows them to move a significant amount of weight. It keeps the bench press a little bit more emphasizing the triceps compared to a standard bench press. But that vertical forearm is kind of the key in a close grip bench press that keeps us fairly efficient and able to move a significant load. There's a variation of that called the JM press, named after a popular powerlifter, where instead of keeping those elbows and those forearms vertical, we actually let the elbow bend a lot. And instead of the bar coming to the lower chest, the bar ends up coming towards the collarbone. We end up in a lot more elbow flexion. It is a less efficient movement. You cannot move near as much load in this close grip bench press variation. But by doing that, we really emphasize loading the triceps through full range of motion. So I use the JM press quite a bit, specifically when I see somebody coming in with tricep tendon issues or late stage tricep tendon rupture repairs. Inefficient movement that allows us to really bias a certain muscle group. We're going to be able to push less load, but it's very valuable at certain phases of rehab. Or let's think maybe you want to load somebody up with hip hinge patterns. And let's say your clinic, unfortunately, does not have heavy enough weights for you to do that. And so you want to train somebody's Romanian deadlift, but at a certain point, they get to loads that no longer really train it efficiently, or it's no longer an overloading stimulus for the back. It's no longer strengthening the low back muscles. So when we talk about deadlift or hip hinge points of performance, one thing that's really important for us is to engage the lats. The lats are going to keep the bar close to our hip joint. That makes us more efficient. Well, if we want to take the same weight and make it more challenging, we can actually decrease our efficiency a little bit. And so maybe when we hip hinge, we purposely let somebody allow those dumbbells to drift further away from the body. When that happens, they're going to feel their lumbar spine get loaded more. And if we're smart about our prescription, we can use these inefficient positions to do a better job of loading people. And this is one that I think you do need to have some strength and conditioning experience to start playing with this more and more. If you've never touched a load, if you've not practiced some of these lifts yourself or these variations yourself, I think you need to do that before you start doing this in the clinic. But don't box yourself into always having to be in the perfect biomechanical position when lifting, because there are some advantages to getting out of position a little bit. Next loading strategy, isometrics. And so I think a lot of us are going to be familiar with isometrics in terms of their potential pain relief effects. So if you look at like Ebony Rio's research on patellar tendinopathy in volleyball players, they found that 5 45-second leg extension isometrics created a significant reduction in pain during functional movements for those individuals. Some of that research has been questioned in other areas of the body, but certainly we can see in some tendinopathies that isometrics have a pain relieving effect. But I think we need to use isometrics more in terms of our strengthening to individuals. And I don't mean wimpy isometrics like we're talking like our rotator cuff isometrics where we're going 10-second isometrics against a wall like we see in so many post-op protocols. I mean heavy isometrics. And so a couple different ways I utilize those. So number one, as you've seen, like if you've seen somebody post-op meniscus debridement, that's a discussion for another day, whether or not that surgery is warranted or not. But let's say somebody has a meniscus debridement, they come into the clinic, you want to start loading up the squat, but right now maybe their knee's not tolerating going up and down through range of motion repeatedly. So maybe you have that individual do sit squats. You sit down on a box, on a chair, on a medicine ball. They barely lift their hips off the ball. They sit back down and they repeat that a few times. If they're doing that with proper form, that's going to be a really challenging movement to do. I mean, I've had 65-year-olds and 5-time national champion Olympic lifters that are in their low 20s. I've had both of those struggle and work like crazy doing these sit squats. It's kind of hard to explain the technique of that here on the podcast. If you want to dive into that movement specifically more and how to load that up and do it properly, if you go to my website, thebarbellphysio.com, you can find articles on the sit squat that will really walk through proper technique there. But that's a great option when we want to avoid pain in joints that maybe aren't really tolerating going through motion repeatedly. But then from just a strength performance, like if you're trying to get stronger and you're not using isometrics every now and then, I think you're missing out. And typically when we're talking about pure strength, we're talking about isometrics in two different things. Either we could be pushing against an unyielding object. So think of like setting up spotter bars on a squat rack that aren't movable at a certain height, and you're doing a deadlift up to that height where the bar's underneath the spotter arms, and then you're pulling into that immovable object. Or the other technique we'll see a lot of people do is where they just pause and hold a movement in a certain position for a period of time. But using either of those is fantastic from a strength perspective. And where I'm typically going to do that is where the position where I find somebody's technique breaks down or where they're weakest. So let's say somebody deadlifting, they always tend to miss deadlifts. Like when the bar gets to their knees, they get a good leg drive off the ground, they can get the bar up to their knees, but that's where they tend to fail their heavy lifts. So what might that look like for that individual? As we're doing deadlifts in our training, we're lifting the bar up and we're pausing for a second or two when the bar's at the knees, and then we finish the lift. We're just trying to get more time under tension in that weak position, but play with isometrics significantly more in the clinic and with your own movement practice. Tempo. We probably talk about tempo more than some of these other strategies, but I think it warrants discussing a little bit more today and a reminder of how important tempo can be. So slowing movements down is often going to make the same weight feel significantly more intense. So if you're doing bench press with 135 pounds and you're doing reps rapidly versus going down 5 seconds, up 3 seconds, or some slow tempo, like that slow tempo is going to make it significantly harder and increase the intensity when maybe we don't have enough weight. Or maybe when a joint is not tolerating heavyweight, joint or muscle, like we can't load it so heavy, maybe we go slower to increase the relative intensity that we're working at. But I think we also have to address that we know that tempo work is really good for a couple other things. Number one, it creates positive adaptations to tendons. Increasing time under tension creates positive adaptations in terms of muscle hypertrophy. But we often don't think about the fact that going slower with time under tension and slower reps is also going to have some pretty positive benefits in terms of motor learning and self-modulating pain during activities. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you're working on somebody's squat form and you're trying to get them to improve their torso position while they squat. If they're dropping down and standing up really rapidly, maybe they don't have a whole lot of time to think about that new cue you gave them to think about. Instead, when we slow it down and they're going 5 seconds down, pausing for a second in the bottom, then up fast, that slower tempo gives them time to feel when they're moving out of position, gives them time to process and think through those cues that you've given them, gives you time to coach them during the actual movement. Or maybe this is somebody that's having pain. Let's say they're having patellofemoral pain when they squat. We slow down the tempo. Now that athlete, as they're going down into the squat, they can feel like, okay, my knee pain's kicking on. What can I do? Can I drive my knees further out? Can I change my torso position or how far forward, backwards my knees are? Can they find different ways to self-modify these activities? And so often having individuals work out with tempo is going to allow them to do that. 2 more for y'all today. Partial range of motion. So partial range of motion can be great in terms of a loading strategy when we want to avoid painful positions. So let's talk about the bench press like we did earlier. Somebody's shoulder becomes symptomatic in that extended full range of motion position. Let's switch them to a floor press. Let's limit that range of motion a little bit, still allow us to get a heavy horizontal pressing variation on board without hitting that painful range of motion. While I do also believe wholeheartedly that usually full range of motion is better for hypertrophy and strength, there is also research saying that partial range of motions are valuable in terms of muscle hypertrophy. So Gatto 2019 GOTO 2019 study, they looked at tricep extensions with partial range of motion versus full range of motion. And what they actually found in that study was that partial range of motion produced greater muscle hypertrophy in those individuals. So essentially they were going in the partial range of motion from a 90-degree angle to 45-degree angle. So staying in this range of motion that kept muscle tension on the entire time, never let the moment arm reduce enough that the triceps got a moment to rest. And so they induced the hypoxic environment by going through that partial range of motion. So again, not typical that I think partial range of motions are better overall for hypertrophy, but it's important for us to realize that there are some benefits to going partial range of motion in terms of avoiding painful areas and keeping time under tension in mechanical positions that allow the muscle that we're trying to focus on to kind of be stuck in a nonstop working environment. So play around with partial range of motions, as well as final loading strategy, 1.5 reps. So doing a movement where you go through full range of motion, then perform half of the range of motion, back down to full depth, full range of motion. So a great example of this is like goblet squat 1.5s, which are just a brutal exercise that I think more people should be using in their strengthening of the lower extremity. So we do a full depth squat, we come up partially, full depth squat all the way up. So 1.5 reps for every actual repetition that you do. These 1.5 reps are a great way to increase time under tension and kind of the hardest parts of movements. They're going to, because our time under tension is so elevated as well, they're going to also, like we talked about earlier, decrease the total amount of weight we can lift. So we're lifting a lighter weight, but keeping the relative intensity high. And I just had a guy, my patient that just left right before jumping on the podcast. We did goblet squat 1.5s, and for a fairly strong guy was crushed with a relatively low load, because it's just a fantastic way to increase the overall time under tension for every repetition. So there you have it, 6 different loading strategies that I don't think we utilize enough. I would love to hear feedback on this. So tag me at the Barbell Physio in your comments on either Facebook or Instagram, or hit me up elsewhere if you're listening on the podcast. I'd love to hear, are there other loading strategies that you really like to use that you don't see enough clinicians using? But hopefully this sparks some ideas for you in your own training and those of your patients. So hope everybody has a great weekend, and hope to see you on the road again here soon.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.